name, right?
Not at this point. I'm sorry.
Hold on. I'm on it.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to 24 Hours of Rare. We are so privileged and happy to have this panel joining us today to talk about caregiving. And this panel is sponsored by Orchard Therapeutics. And we're excited to have them as part of our 24 Hours of Rare celebration this week. And so with that, I am going to turn the panel discussion over to Grace. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Orchard, for sponsoring.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I'm just so excited to be spending some time with you this morning. I've got my teacup, but I'm ready to sit and have a wonderful conversation with all of you over coffee or tea, or for those of you in other time zones, maybe some other delicious beverage. But what I want to do as we get started is just give a chance for you to meet our panel. So I'm Grace Whiting. I'm the president and CEO at the National Alliance for Caregiving. And our organization is based in Washington, D.C. We're a coalition whose mission is to build partnerships and research, advocacy, and innovation so that we can make life better for friend and family caregivers. And in doing that work, we do work on Capitol Hill as well as with global colleagues. So I'm very excited to be here, particularly on the week we're celebrating World Rare Disease Day. Now, one of the themes is around rare disease is the idea of being rare and zebras. So you see zebras everywhere. But I'm going to ask each speaker, as you introduce yourself, what animal would you pick to represent your life experience and why? And if we could, let's start with Mosami.
Hi, good morning. My name is Mosami Bose. I am an assistant professor at Montclair State University in Montclair, New Jersey. I got into the rare disease space because I am the caregiver of a child with a rare disease, and I'm really excited to be here and seeing Grace, because we see each other a lot these days. And yeah, in terms of, should I answer the octopus? I'm sorry, I was going to say I'm an octopus is the question is the answer to your question. I would say that in my experience that that I would consider myself an octopus, just because I like octopus as an animal, and they seem like they've got their stuff together. They have a lot of arms and I'm assuming because they do a lot of things, and I think that's really what a caregiver is we do a lot of things, and they also look kind of fierce, and I feel like as a caregiver I sort of learned how to be as fierce as I could be, and that's what I would choose.
That's awesome. So next we're going to go to Elise, and same question. If you can tell us just a little bit about yourself, and tell us what animal you would pick to represent your life experience and why.
Sure. Thanks, Grace. My name is Elise Drake, and I am the research projects coordinator for the Cure Sanfilippo Foundation. I became involved in the rare disease space when my daughter Kira, who's 11 now, was diagnosed at age 5 with Sanfilippo syndrome, which is also known as MPS III. And at that point, I pretty quickly got connected to the Cure Sanfilippo Foundation and have been working with them since that point. And I would say the animal that kind of represents my journey would probably be a butterfly, because when I think about the evolution that has taken place from when my daughter was first diagnosed to where we all are at this point, it's definitely been a very large kind of change and metamorphoses from a caterpillar to this stage of butterfly, where I feel like we've done a lot of work and kind of continue to flourish.
Thank you. I think that's a symbol of hope, and for many people, and most of me, to your point about an octopus and having all your arms in the air, I think that's a great depiction. So Francis, same question. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work in this area, and what animal you would pick if you were picking one to represent your life experience.
Thank you, Grace, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. So I'm Francis Pang, and I'm responsible for health economics and access at Orchard Therapeutics, which is an in vivo gene therapy company focused on rare diseases. So I'm based here in the UK. I'm a health economist by training, with more than 20 years of experience in price and reimbursement, access, and health economics. Started my career in academia at the University of York, and also have been in a NICE committee actually for the last 8 years as the industry representative. I was most recently head of access at Amicus Therapeutics, and helped achieve reimbursement for an oral treatment for Fabry disease, and also worked at Biogen as well. In terms of an animal, yeah, I would say that I am an owl. Like an owl, it is really important to focus and zoom in actually at the crucial moments. And whilst, I think it's really at the same time important to see the bigger picture, right, and zoom out. And sometimes I feel that certainly in my field of sort of health economics and health technology assessment, perhaps people do not see the bigger picture, and hence some of the research that will be presented this afternoon during the panel session, is all about seeing a bigger picture, seeing the the impact on caregivers, right, and so forth, and so I think an owl is quite appropriate. Of course, an owl can be quite nocturnal and makes quite pleasant hooting sounds, but I'm not really a morning person, and I can't sing, so I think the owl analogy doesn't extend too far. So thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate that, though, especially being an economist, which the dismal science, the importance of being wise and being able to really look at the issues from a lot of different angles. So now that we've had a chance to introduce ourselves, we're going to actually hear from each of these very distinguished speakers, different perspectives, including the understanding the disease from the caregiver point of view, understanding how caregivers can influence better clinical trial endpoints, and then the industry perspective and some of that macroeconomic thinking that Francis just alluded to. So we're going to get started with Mosumi, and then followed by Elise, and then Francis, and then afterwards we're gonna have a discussion. So make sure that you've got your coffee cup full, and please feel free to enter in questions into the Q&A as the discussions are going on. And after we hear from everyone, we'll come back to that. So Mosumi, I'm going to pass the baton to you to talk a little bit about informing better understanding of disease as a caregiver.
Okay, thank you. Should I be sharing my screen? Or hold on.
Yes, share your screen.
Okay, got you. And sorry about that. Start over. Okay. So, I'll just start by saying thank you to the Lord family and my city med and Jenna Swan for inviting me to talk here today. I'm going to be, the title of this talk is Caregiver Reported Outcomes in Rare Pediatric Diseases, but I'm going to be presenting the data from one study where I focus on one specific disease, but I'm hoping that disease, my experience with that disease will be almost like a case study or a template for other rare disease communities, and we can talk more about that during the panel discussion. So just a little bit about myself. As I said before, I got into the rare disease space not through my professional background, which I am a researcher by profession, but the rare disease sort of part of it really came with my experience with my first son, who was born with Zellweger spectrum disorder, which is a rare metabolic disorder, which is actually a disease I'm going to be talking about today. And my experience with him really it changed my life in so many ways. And I was, after he had passed away in 2011, I really just sort of changed my career trajectory to focus on rare disease research, and I was very, very fortunate to have a network of people who supported me through that training, and it was very sort of boot camp type training, but I was through the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network and the training that I received through them, I was able to develop a lot of skills and also get some of the resources, some really great resources that were able to facilitate some of the data that I'm going to share with you today. So, as I said before, I'm going to be talking about Zellweger spectrum disorder, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of background information on ZSD. ZSD is a disorder of peroxisome biogenesis, where peroxisomes, which are these organelles, are found in every single cell of the body, are not assembled properly, and therefore they don't really work very well. As a spectrum disorder, this disease is very clinically heterogeneous, and it's so clinically heterogeneous that before it was regarded as a spectrum disorder because of this sort of shared peroxisome dysfunction basis, as well as some of the similarities and genetic variations that were discovered. The spectrum disorder was regarded as 4 different diseases, which you see in this sort of second bullet point here.
Simi, I apologize for interrupting. What we are seeing on the screen now is just PowerPoint without the presentation actually running.
Uh-oh. Let's see.
Would you like me?
Let me see if I can figure this out. So let me go back to.
If you want, I can run it from here very quickly for you. You just need to stop.
Why don't we do that?
Okay. Just go ahead and stop share on your side and tell me what slide you're on.
Okay. So I'll just ask you to advance ahead, if that's okay.
Sure will.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'm not very technically savvy. That's not what I have my background in. Okay. So I was speaking before about how this was a very clinically heterogeneous disease, and what you see here in this second bullet point is basically the different diseases that it was originally regarded as, and then it was later, because of the shared peroxisome basis and these sort of similarities in genetic variants, it's regarded as this sort of all part of this larger spectrum disorder. So speaking of genetics, just really briefly, ZSD is attributable to pathogenic variants in a group of genes called the PEX genes, which encode for these proteins that are responsible for the assembly of peroxisomes. And what this means clinically is that because peroxisomes are in every single cell of the body, there are multiple organ systems affected. It is still very clinically heterogeneous, which makes it really hard in terms of trying to develop effective endpoints for clinical trials, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But here is just a list of some of the common symptoms. There's usually a CNS component in this disease, where there is a leukodystrophy that contributes to the progressive nature of the disorder. It's often life-limiting. Sometimes there's seizures, there's sensory dysfunction. There's muscle tone issues that results in feeding difficulties. There's also oftentimes liver dysfunction, as well as endocrine abnormalities, such as adrenal insufficiency. Next slide, please. So I like to use ZSD as a sort of case study for conducting the type of research that I've done in this disease as an application to other diseases, mainly because I have so much experience with this particular disease, but also because some of the issues and the challenges that are present in terms of managing care and sort of understanding research in ZSD, they plague other rare diseases too. In terms of clinical care and current research, there are very, very few treatment options for ZSD. Most of the treatments are meant to address symptoms and are supportive. There is very little published natural history of ZSD. There's been some literature published on the clinical characterization of the disease, but these are very, very small studies. Most of them are based on retrospective medical chart reviews, case studies, and very, very small clinician-led studies. And put together, all of this just really provides very little guidance in terms of how to manage care if you're a professional treating a child with a disease, as well as very little guidance on if there were opportunities for therapeutics, how would we effectively design a clinical trial that would be meaningful to this patient population. Next slide, please. So I'm going to switch gears for a second and just talk about real quick about, in these types of rare pediatric diseases, how important the caregiver is. And we already know this, but I'll just sort of say just a couple of things. Number one, first of all, when I talk about family caregivers, I'm referring to parents, step-parents, and legal guardians, these people that really see these patients every single day. And my contention is that family caregivers probably know more about this disease as well as the state of health of their child, more so than clinicians, because caregivers are with their child every single day, and they have a knowledge of the disorder, and they have their own observations of their child's health every single day. So some of the changes that they see in their child's health may fall under the radar at the level of the clinic. Moreover, we've got we've got these diseases like CSD where you have multiple organ systems affected, and as a result, there's multiple specialists that a family needs to sort of interact with to get a sort of full picture of what is their child's health. And although we have started talking about better care coordination, it's a lot of that responsibility in terms of synthesizing all of this information that on a patient from different specialists that really falls on that family caregiver. So if we put this together, we've got a field, a rare disease, just like many other rare diseases, where there's not that much information known that's published on the disease. We don't know very much about the natural history, which may have an impact on care and clinical trials. And then over here, you've got a group of people that know so much about this disease. And so these were the sort of rationales that I used to execute this study that I'll talk about really quickly. Next slide, please. So basically, using this information, what I did is I created a survey tool that people could take online called the ZSD Symptom Inventory. And here, I basically asked caregivers, just tell us about the symptoms that your child has. It was a 50 to 60 survey item tool where I asked about very specific symptoms. And I used the RDCRN, the Rare Diseases Clinical Research Network Registry, as a resource to administer the survey as well as recruit for this study. And what we did was, next slide, please. What we did was we asked questions about specific symptoms related to these different organ systems. We also asked questions about therapies. I'm not going to be talking about that here today, but it was the sort of intention was very simple: asking parents, does your child have the symptoms, in order to gain more information about A, what symptoms are these patients having? B, how often are they occurring? As a way to sort of prioritize, what symptoms should we be focusing on in terms of care, as well as thinking about, outcome measures for clinical trials. So that's really what I was looking at. I was looking at how, what symptoms were popping up in these survey responses, as well as how often these symptoms were occurring within this population. And I recruited both families of children who were living, as well as families of children who had passed away, knowing full well that the recall sort of time in terms of answering these survey questions were different. So I kept these groups separately, but I also used these two groups to sort of compare how different are their responses. Is there a recall bias that is causing difference, that may be responsible for some of the differences between these two groups, or any other variables? Next slide, please. So here are some of the results that we got. We aimed to recruit 100 families. We almost got there. We had 92 that consented. We had about a little over 80 that were actually included in the analysis for this part of the study. The majority of the people that participated, family caregivers that participated, were mothers. 2/3 of them were families of children that were still living. And I'm going to start going through some of our findings. Next slide, please. And one of the first questions that we asked is, what is the severity of your child's disorder? This was not a technical question. It wasn't based on any sort of symptoms. It was the parents' own sort of perception based on what they've seen on their child on how severe is this disease. And a finding that we thought was interesting is that the majority of the families of deceased children reported that they considered their child severe. So this was something that I think will be useful when we look at sort of the interpretation of the data. Next slide, please. I know I don't have a whole lot of time here, so I really am not trying to, go over each of these points. What I really want to show is this is just a fraction of some of the data that we collected with a simple survey. And, there's so much more that we were able to sort of get from these families. If you could advance to, I have a part circled that I want to highlight that I feel like is the most interesting part. We looked at we asked about adrenal insufficiency, and what we found is that in about 40 to near 50% of our families reported that their child had adrenal insufficiency. This is this is almost twice what has been reported previously in the literature. So this is something that I thought was really interesting. That previous reports may be underestimating the report of adrenal insufficiency. Next slide, please. And if you could advance to the next, something else I've circled here. We found similar results with seizures. Previous reports show that that seizures occur in about a quarter of the patients with ZSD, and our results suggest that it's much, much higher. So this is something to at least take into consideration, because both seizures and adrenal insufficiency have pretty considerable burden on families. So if we are underestimating the occurrence of these symptoms through these clinical studies, that that might have an impact on overall care. Next slide, please. So, I'm just giving you a brief snapshot of the data that we did for this study. But overall, what I really wanted to show here is by engaging the caregiver population, we were able to conduct a study which I believe is probably the largest representation of ZSD patients studied. And although there are plenty of case studies that sort of clinically characterize this disease, this is the first estimate of the actual prevalence of things like dental symptoms or other symptoms that have been commonly associated with the disease, but we have no idea how often they occur in a population. Because we engaged bereaved families, since the bereaved families really primarily reported that they found that they felt their child was more on the severe end of the spectrum, this is one of the first studies that really provide more insight on some of the more severely affected families, we think. And overall, the big sort of takeaway here is, number one, we may be underestimating the impact of this disease on families when we're strictly relying on just clinical reports or case studies. And number two, the family caregiver has so much insight and experience in terms of understanding the impact of this disease. And this insight may be very, very valuable in the guidance of designing effective and meaningful clinical trials with outcomes that mean something to these families. So that's about it. Next slide is just my acknowledgments and my thank yous. And this is my team at Montclair State. As I said before, the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network was really instrumental. And here's my family on an outing pre-COVID at Sky Zone. Thank you so much for your time.
Mosumi, thank you so much for walking through that and especially giving us some concrete examples of the type of insights that a friend or family member can provide in the delivery of care. So very appreciative. So I'm going to pass it on to Elise, who's going to talk to us a little bit about understanding that intersection between what a caregiver may know and clinical trial endpoints, which I think is a perfect way to sort of bridge from what we know caregivers can do and sort of that industry perspective. So I will pass the baton on to you.
Thanks, Grace. And I just want to say how thankful I am to be part of this panel with all of you, and appreciate being able to share some of this information and some of our journey with this research in the hopes that it might be able to help other groups that are starting to think about using this type of caregiver data and information in maybe a similar way. I will attempt to share my screen here. Okay. Is that working?
Looks great.
Okay.
Looks
excellent.
perfect.
So I'll be talking about just using the understanding that we have of the disease as a caregiver or provider to influence better clinical trial endpoints. And when we're talking about clinical trials in particular, and also even potential treatments for these types of rare diseases, I think we could probably all agree that we've got this same shared goal at heart of helping people live better lives and also reducing their suffering. But how we view that goal and what that means and how we actually get to that goal can really be very different depending on who we're asking about it. So when we're talking about, making lives better, well, what does better mean? The answer to that really depends on who's actually asking that question. And there was a researcher recently that included this quote in a publication that we think really kind of gets to some of the difficulties that we've seen, at least in our disease population, in regards to trials and research. And they said that most research questions are really posed from a medical or regulatory perspective, and they're often based on what's called the culture of the laboratory, which is excessively focused on basic science and often removed from the true needs of the patients. And within Sanfilippo research, we've got recently several trials that have failed to show significant evidence of improvement based on neurocognitive outcome measures, or were terminated by the sponsor as a management decision. And this has really been heartbreaking for a large portion of our community, especially for many patients in those trials that voiced that they believe that their children were getting better, but it wasn't being seen enough through evidence as defined by these kind of medical or regulatory areas. So we even have Dr. Woodcock, who's the director of CBER for the FDA, just kind of underscoring the importance of this when she said that we've really got to understand the impact of the disease from the perspective of the patients who have it, or perhaps the caregivers that are taking care of them, and also look at what they consider to be most valuable in terms of those symptoms and making them better before any measurement is set up, as we're kind of moving forward to really make this type of research on the trials patient focused. So we know here what the FDA's stance is on it, and we've also seen evidence where they've tried to incorporate this even into their templates. And this review template shows that they're asking for patient preference studies to be included from submitted studies or scientific publications. So I'll be talking about a research study that we conducted with caregivers of patients with Sanfilippo syndrome. I'll also talk in a moment a little bit more about the disease very briefly, but I just want to emphasize that, we were looking at three things through this research and through the publication that came out of it. We were looking at disease burden among the caregivers, but we were also looking at symptom and the impact, which symptoms seem to have the largest impact on the caregivers and their children and their family members, and really trying to explore and identify what that would be, and also asking about which treatment needs have largely been unmet up to this point in our disease population. And we found out of that research, and I'll discuss in a little bit more detail, but we found that there were really these multiple domains of unmet treatment needs that were identified by these caregiver parents. And these needs that were being unmet really impacted the child and the family and the parents' quality of life in a very significant manner. And the patients in our study reported this high value on even moderate benefits towards the treatment of these symptoms, and also emphasized how any treatment that would slow or even stop symptom progression and not necessarily be a cure were really highly valued by these parents in our population. For this research, we used an approach that was consistent with what CDER and the FDA was guiding us on, and we also used a multidisciplinary advisory committee to kind of inform this research, because we were really looking towards a data-driven and scientifically minded approach to collect this data to publish, to be able to kind of share the voice of this caregiver, especially for regulatory agencies that were making decisions, and also for potential drug development. So the caregivers were all parents of children with Sanfilippo syndrome, which is also known as MPS III. This is a lysosomal disease that is autosomal recessive. The MPS diseases, the mucopolysaccharidosis diseases, there's 7 of them, and Sanfilippo, MPS III, is one of the more common ones. It comes from an enzyme deficiency leading to storage of heparan sulfate, secondary storage of proteins and lipids, and their own systemic inflammation. There are 4 different subtypes, with type A being the most common, and there's a combined incidence of about 1 in 70,000. It is a multi-systemic metabolic disease, and really the prominent phenotype is neurodegenerative and neurobehavioral. So all of the parents were caregivers of Sanfilippo syndrome, and what we did is we conducted focus groups with these parents, and also had them complete questionnaires. And that is where the data for the research in this publication came from. We did thematic analysis to explore these different symptoms and their impact, and which treatment needs the parents were saying were really being unmet. Out of the analysis of those themes, we had these 2 overarching domains that came out of it. The first was cognitive, behavioral, or psychological impacts of the disease, and the second domain was different health or physical impacts. Out of those 2 overarching domains, we found 14 primary themes that came out of that, and all of these are listed here, and you can see that they really cover many different systems and areas of symptoms that our children can experience. And this is really what caregivers were primarily saying were the symptoms that have the most impact on quality of life for these children. And you can see that many of them go way beyond kind of the neurocognitive or neurodevelopmental symptoms that are primarily being used for measures in clinical trials for our disease up to this point. So I've just got a couple of slides with quotes that came out of these focus groups that we thought were representative or kind of very telling of where the caregiver is coming from and what their perspective of improvement or change or better might mean to them. And we do have one that kind of addresses the global impact of these symptoms. And one parent said, "I don't care if it's not a cure. I mean, to keep him at where he's at right now, that would be amazing. I would do anything for that." And then another one was, "Our expectation and what we'd like to get from treatments for Sanfilippo are relatively small. Some of those small things have a big impact on us." And then we also heard many parents really emphasize several times in our focus groups and also in the questionnaires that any kind of benefit, even small or insignificant or incremental by other standards, could be really meaningful in the quality of life for children and for the family and caregivers of these children. And this parent said, "You know, I'll take that she can kind of sit and enjoy doing something for for 3 more minutes than you were able to before. I'll even take like an intensive invasive medical procedure to get me 6 more months. I'll take any of it, and I think any of it would be good for her. And we also saw for many parents this theme of, you know, kind of very high willingness to take a risk in terms of treatment, even if it would make any kind of change. For Sanfilippo syndrome, there is no approved treatment at the moment. And this kind of willingness to almost try anything was a common thread that we saw throughout the focus groups. There was also an emphasis on pain, which up to this point, until a recent current clinical trial that I'll mention in just a few moments, we really haven't had any outcome measures looking at assessing pain in any of the trials or potential treatment endeavors up to this point for our disease. But it's another theme that really came out as primary with our caregiving parents. And one parent said, here's what I think, like, I don't even care if the skills are maintained, I just don't want her to be in pain. So from our research, we found these caregiver-directed treatment targets that we think really could be helpful in kind of informing, you know, future treatments and possibly any regulatory decisions. From the publication and these focus groups and our data with the caregivers, we found that parents really can readily identify symptoms that would provide a higher quality of life if improved through a new therapy. And they noted that even these modest benefits to those symptoms would really be highly valued for their family. Acknowledging that clinical trials in Sanfilippo syndrome really historically and traditionally up to this point have focused on these global cognitive measures, parents in our study really stressed that they place a high value on treatment outcomes that targeted kind of narrower aspects and subsets of data. And this type of research and data and what we get out of it, we think can provide kind of this really valuable insight into parents' treatment priorities and also the impact of various disease manifestations that can be used to guide the selection of outcome measures in clinical trials, and also selection of symptoms to target for future therapeutic research development, and also, again, for regulatory decision-making. And kind of one example of, you know, where this guidance can take place and, you know, something that can be done within trial design is starting to use individualized endpoints, which really hadn't been in our disease community kind of up to this point. One example I have, though, is an ongoing clinical trial that's currently occurring. The Cure Sanfilippo Foundation partnered with academic partners at UCLA to begin this drug repurposing trial of a drug called anakinra to look at symptom improvement in Sanfilippo children. And the measures and the outcomes that were used to determine if there was improvement were really driven by a lot of this caregiver information and data and the voice of the caregiver. And also the measures are across many different symptom domains, and they're not narrowly looking at just one symptom or one area of improvement. And they're also using individualized endpoints to measure improvement in symptoms or functions. And these individualized endpoints are based on kind of what the patient or the caregiver of the patient is, you know, desiring to be addressed. And this is just kind of one example of how maybe picking endpoints that are reasonably achievable might be really helpful in kind of looking at what better is or what improvements can look like. I think we're holding on questions until the end, if I'm correct.
Yes.
So if so, I'll stop there.
No, I mean, I thank you so much for that. And I think your question about what is good and thinking about what is actually meaningful for a person and the person they're caring for, especially the piece about looking at function, not just biomedical endpoints, but understanding how those biomedical endpoints relate to function and the ability to really be a family and be together. So thank you so much for this perspective. So now we are going to hear from Francis, who's going to talk to us about the industry perspective, and in particular, how caregiving data can tell the story of disease burden, as well as educate key stakeholders in disease treatment.
Thank you very much, Grace. So can you hear me? Can you see my screen? Presentation. Sorry, Jeff, would you be able to show my slides actually and advance them for me? I think I have a technical problem. Great, thank you, Jeff, and yeah, thank you, Grace, for the introduction. Certainly, sort of thank you for being part of the panel today. So, next slide, please, Jeff. So, it already starts in terms of actually how we think about how to demonstrate the value of our therapies at Orchard, and we've been thinking about this in actually quite a big way, and really, our philosophy on value really does start with the child and allows us to answer the fundamental question, actually. What does it mean for a child to potentially live without a devastating sort of genetic disease? And, of course, the child whose life is restored benefits immensely, but the impact actually branches out to those around him or her as well. In terms of the family and the community, I mean, as any parent knows, particularly a parent who has cared for a child with a serious and potentially fatal disease, transforming the life of a child transforms the lives of everybody in the family and even the broader community. In terms of the health system, healthcare professionals have the opportunity to be part of something potentially curative. And in some cases, the health system saves resources that would have otherwise been spent on non-transformational care. In terms of society, each of us in a broader society benefits. No matter who we are, we all benefit if we live in a world where the most devastating diseases that impact children can be stopped in their tracks. And I think you would agree that it's simply a better world. So this kind of holistic framework is a framework that we actually use in terms of guiding our evidence generation efforts, which you heard from the previous two speakers. Next slide, please. And demonstrating value, does require quite a structured approach. Actually, generating evidence is not a costless exercise. It incurs, financial resources, but also incurs, time as well. And we know that caregivers, especially, are very, very busy people, and certainly with their caregiving duties. And and some of this research that I present. Later on, we'll show that. So, you have to be very, very respectful of, the time for conducting such surveys, right? And you only know, that you only have an opportunity to conduct the research once, right? And with rare diseases, recruitment takes significant time. So, you have to be very, respectful about that. So, yes, in terms of evidence generation. It has to be disciplined, and here what we have are the different types of study that could be used really to kind of demonstrate the value, such as the caregiver survey, which we'll talk about. You might be able to look at patient preferences in terms of a utility vignette study. You might be able to look at what are the attributes of a treatment that people would like to see, actually, in terms of a discrete choice study. You can measure patient-reported outcomes, as what Mr. Mee explained very elegantly earlier. Elisa also spoke about incorporating endpoints into trials, right? You can also do that too. But what you try to do is actually place this into a health economic framework called a cost effectiveness analysis framework, and this is used by healthcare decision makers such as NICE in the UK, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, or ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, for evaluating the costs and benefits of technology. Next slide, please. And due to the societal nature of benefits of therapies for rare diseases, it is important to capture aspects outside of the healthcare system sort of payer. And hence, when I made the opening remarks about the owl, it's so easy to zoom in on particular aspects, right? But you need to have that bigger holistic picture, and hence, this kind of caregiver burden and quality of life research can be very, very beneficial. So it is certainly an honor to share with you today, some of the insights on some of the work that we've done at Orchard together with an organization called Magnolia Innovation based in New York, and also a number of patient organizations as well. And the research itself was many, many months in the making. I mean, it took well over sort of a year and a half to conduct the research. And we certainly thank all the patient organizations that were involved in the recruitment of caregivers for the research, but also helped with the validation phase of the questionnaire. I mean, we recognize very, very early on that this is a unique opportunity to collect data, and not one in which we would be likely to ever get another opportunity. So it is very, very important to ensure that the survey is going to generate the most high quality data possible, right? And to do that, you need to ask the questions in the right way, right? And make sure that the questions get at what you're trying to ask, but also are at the right pitch and tone as well. And that's where the patient organization input was invaluable. So what we have here was a caregiver survey, right? And the study's objective was to investigate the impact of caring for metachromatic leukodystrophy, or MLD, patients in terms of disease burden in several areas, including social function, daily activities, time investment, and financial impact, and also physical and emotional impact. And the data will be used by patient organizations when talking with their membership, but also promoting the disease, and from a kind of company's perspective, we would use these in access discussions, with a number of health technology assessment agencies, really to highlight the impact of MLD on caregivers and children. Next slide, please. And we surveyed 21 caregivers across 3 countries: the United Kingdom, United States, and Germany. We also do have the survey running currently in France. The study is fully recruited, and the data is currently undergoing analysis. So hopefully, for a future iteration of this event, I'll be able to share some of that data. And for the inclusion in the study, the caregiver had to be the primary caregiver, and the child had not been treated with gene therapy. Next slide, please. So just a couple of highlights here. There were approximately sort of 20 outpatient visits per year, with 3 inpatient visits, and an average of 11 days spent per inpatient visit per year. In terms of travel time to the facility for treatment, there was a median of 2.5 hours of travel time in the US, and 1.3 to 1.5 hours in the UK and Germany. There was approximately 6 hours of nursing care on average. But the time caregivers spent on caregiving duties, right, was about 17 hours. And if you think about 6 6 or 7 hours for sleeping in the evening, right? It's a 24-hour, activity, right? So, it is caregiving is a 24-hour activity. And next slide, please. And in terms of the distribution of these activities, next slide, please, Jeff. And these 17 hours spent sort of caregiving for the child with MLD were spent on things such as general health maintenance, such as bathing, brushing teeth, changing diapers, emptying the catheter, moving and lifting, coordination of drop-off, pick-up at school, extracurricular activities with some of the siblings, maintaining temperature, checking vitals, perhaps feeding, medication administration, the various types of therapies such as physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, music therapy, household chores, and then, if possible, to fit in, also gainful employment in terms of work, working remotely, part-time, and some of the caregivers actually had multiple part-time jobs or were unemployed. Next slide, please. Jeff, could you please advance the slide, please? And what we found here is that a high proportion had to cut down on regular activities, all work, and all accomplished less than they would like to. And 82% believe that they had forgone significant income. 81% believe that MLD affected their employment status, and then 71% believe that it impacted their career progression, because caregiving is a full-time job. Some of the parents felt that they had to put their career aspirations aside, actually. So MLD does have an impact on work productivity and those kind of aspects. Next slide, please. And 67% of caregivers actually gave up work or switched to part-time roles as a result of their child's condition, and then 81% sort of missed work. I mean, the average days lost was 18 days per annum, and the financial strain from out-of-pocket medical costs and lost income from having to miss work amounted to approximately $25,000 per year on average in the US. Next slide, please. And it's not just the quality of life impact on the person with the condition. The caregiver quality of life also does also get dramatically affected, right? And what we did here was actually measure the quality of life of caregivers for MLD, and we applied this quality of life instrument called the EuroQol 5D or EQ5D, and this instrument is one of those patient preference instruments, and it's used to generate utilities, and it's on a scale from 0 to 1, and it's used by health technology assessment organizations such as ICER in the US, NICE in the UK, really to generate quality adjusted life years, QALYs. And the application of the EQ5D on caregivers, was one of the very first applications for caregivers for a rare disease. And then what we found was that 71% experienced moderate to severe anxiety and/or depression, and 62% reported experiencing moderate to severe pain or discomfort. And perhaps that comes from the various sort of lifting activities and carrying activities that are required. Also, we compared the utilities, right, of caregivers compared to the general population. So, this is on a scale from 0 to 1, and the utility was almost 10% lower than the general population. So, let's give you an example. In the US, the general population utility is 0.905, but for the caregivers for MLD, utility was 0.825. And you could see that same trend also in Germany and also the UK as well. So there's definitely a quality of life impact on caregivers, which we've measured here. Final slide, please. And in terms of opportunities for further research, there's certainly scope to generate further evidence to demonstrate disease burden and the broader impacts inside and outside the healthcare system. So I mentioned earlier some of the potential kind of study frameworks that could be applied. It certainly would be good to get experience with therapy administration as well, and kind of measuring that kind of qualitative experience. Mentioned earlier the lost work productivity impact. Certainly could look at that as well, and also what is the value of hope actually for a future treatment, and also would welcome any sort of new ideas, and certainly I think the caregiver sort of research space is very exciting right now. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it back to Grace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis. Very appreciative of your presentation. And Jeff, I'm trying to turn my camera on this side, but it looks like it might be stuck.
Okay. I don't think there's anything I can do from the panel I am on, Grace. I apologize.
No problem at all. So can you change it back to the view with all the speakers? And can we just do a quick time check? Because I want to be respectful. I know there are several programs going on for 24 hours of rare. So Mosami and Elise, if you would go ahead and turn your cameras back on.
I actually can't turn my camera on either.
I turned mine on, and it looks like I can see myself on the screen. Can you not see me?
I can see you, and you look fabulous. I'll just say that Mosami and I also look fabulous, even though you can't see our beautiful faces. And I would encourage folks that might be listening in to check in and see if you have any questions. If you would go ahead and enter those into the chat box so that we can discuss them. And then for our speakers, if you would just check and make sure that you don't have two sources of sound, because I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Okay, great. So let's start with the first question, which is about the theme of this event. So the theme of, I'm going to pause real quick. Can y'all also hear the background?
I can.
Okay. Jeff, could you give us some advice here on the background noise?
Grace, it sounds like it's picking up from a secondary microphone on your side.
Okay, is that better? Can you hear me?
It's about the same. We still hear the echo. Grace, you might try just doing a refresh on your browser.
Hello again. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Like, you know, like so many of us, I was talking gleefully to my screen. So I want to get to the question that entered into the chat, which is about this idea of building a caregiving team to support the people who are living with rare disease and their caregivers, and to understand who might be on that team in terms of friends and family. So most of me, at least, want to start with this.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Sure. So Eden asked about building a caregiving team to support patients and caregivers and who might be on that team.
I mean, for us, I can just kind of reflect on who we ended up kind of, I guess, putting on our team in an informal manner that have ended up being most helpful for us and for my daughter. Definitely, you know, various therapists that are really helping, I think, primarily to maintain skills for my daughter, you know, occupational therapy, speech therapy, physical therapy, but also, you know, her physician team and clinical team, as with many patients in this rare disease community, she has multiple specialists, and I think we've been very strategic in selecting the ones that would be, I think, best to be on her team. And then also, you know, certain family members and friends that really, I think, stepped up right away and were willing to walk with us, and especially the ones that didn't, you know, just say, I'm so sorry, I'd like to help, but the ones that said, here is what I can do to help, and here's specifically how I can be here, and here are the different things that I'm going to do for you, and then, you know, consistently checking back in and saying, what else can I do and provide? And then also for us having folks in the community that were part of our team, likely the most instrumental, at least with my daughter, you know, having those that have already walked this journey, provide knowledge and advice and recommendations, and also just be a sounding board and support for us.
I would echo everything Alyssa said, and another thing that I felt was really helpful for us through our experience is looking for skilled nursing was actually super helpful for us, and it was something that I had to really search for to get, you know, an appropriate nursing service, as well as figuring out how to get coverage for that, and not just skilled nursing, but also home health aides. My child had a very medically complex condition, and just anything that could take away from my sort of never-ending task list of things to do in terms of managing care of my child, as well as managing my family, my job, everything else. But those resources were super helpful. And then I'll add that, in terms of, sort of riffing off what Francis had mentioned in terms of the value of hope, interacting with providers that were willing to collaborate with me and really respect the knowledge that I had on my child's condition was a very key sort of criteria I needed. And B, were willing to sort of understand the life-limiting nature of my son's disease and acknowledge that, but also say, hey, well, he's alive now. Let's do everything we can to make you and your child as content as possible. People that are willing to go that sort of extra step instead of just throwing up their hands and being like, well, he's probably not going to see 6 months. So there's nothing I can do now. What am I supposed to do for those 6 months? that was really important in our own family's sort of quality of life and sanity, really.
Thanks so much, Mosami. So, as I shared when we were prepping for this call, I could talk about caregiving all day, but I know we have other things we have to tackle today as well. I want to end on one additional question from our listeners. And this person says, as a mom and the primary caregiver, I feel like I need to keep it all under control for my daughter. I do my crying in the shower. I smile through appointments. I feel like if I did take time for respite, it would communicate that I'm less than and not capable of meeting her needs. But sometimes I get tired and she doesn't get a break from her diagnosis. So why should I take one from caregiving? And one of the things I would just say that we know from the work that we've done on caregiving is that in many cases, when you are a rare caregiver, you experience anticipatory grief or grief related to something called ambiguous loss. So that could be anything from feeling sad about what you thought your life could have been like, or what you imagined your child's life would be like, or just the general stress and strain of living with the rare disease. That said, I think as you look at all of the presentations that we saw today, that it does sometimes feel like you have to go it alone, but you're actually part of an interconnected care network. And there's a ripple effect on other members of your family and your community. And as those people are counting on you, as your daughter is counting on you, at the same time, there are people that care about you and want you to thrive and need you to thrive in order to continue to be in that caregiving role. So I'm going to give our speakers a chance to just respond to this question, in that big picture. And let's start with Francis and then go to Mosami and give Elise the last word.
Yeah, thank you, Grace, and certainly thank you for the question. And as I emphasised in the talk, I mean, I think the caregiving responsibility is 24 hours, right? It's relentless, and if the research you heard today, from the various speakers, I mean, it's you're asking the caregiver who's very exhausted, right, to take away, to use their own time, right, to be able to participate in the survey and the research, right, and you have to be incredibly respectful and appreciative of that, and so I think it's really, really important that any kind of research is adopted with and validated, right, so it generates the highest quality responses possible. You only have one chance to do the research, and the research can be so impactful, right, to the communities that we work with, and also the external stakeholders. So I think it's it's certainly one thing I would say is, like, any kind of caregiving exercise has to be done with extreme care. Any kind of survey has to be well planned and done with extreme care.
And I think, Francis, when you look at that macroeconomic impact, it really speaks to the value of the things that a caregiver may do day to day, just the enormous value to our society. Mosami and Elise.
Sure. So I think the reason that as a caregiver, there needs to be time for yourself as a caregiver is because that, you are the person that is responsible for this, your child or a patient. And if, there is data out there that shows that the level of stress of a caregiver can negatively impact the patient. Even if it's, if you think about it in the health of your child or the patient, Like, you taking care of yourself is actually being the best caregiver to that infant. And there's so many other reasons, but just right there is that it's clear that your own health is going to impact, positively or negatively, your child's health. And I think that it at least is a good starting point to sort of go off of. I'll end that because I could talk about this all day.
I absolutely agree with what Masumi just said. And my background and training is actually, I have my PhD in clinical psychology, which feels like a lifetime ago now. But yeah, we do have so much research demonstrating that these caregivers are able to take better care of their kids if they're also taking care of themselves. And I think it's natural to feel that, if we are taking time for ourselves or any self-care, it might be at the expense of, time we could be devoting to our child, but we're going to be in a better place to be the best we can for them if we're actually taking care of ourselves. And I would say just being assertive about kind of putting some type of coping toolkit together that you can go to or rely on when you are feeling extremely overwhelmed, or kind of that pool is empty of what you can give, is another way to help your child or whomever you're giving care for.
That's great. Well, thank you all so much, and a big thank you to Orchid for today's presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, from us here at MyCMed, thank you. Eden and I have appreciated so much everybody's participation and willingness, and thank you, Francis, Lise, Grace, Masumi. I want to thank Jenna. I know she is watching there, but for organizing this, sponsoring this. This has been great information. I love the statistics and what you guys were sharing, and your stories along with it too. So thank you all again. Thank you, Orchard. Coming up next for us here on the 24 Hours of Rare is a Rare Dad panel. It will be happening at 12 noon Eastern time. We hope that you can join us. Thank you, everyone, for your contribution to 24 Hours of Rare.